now. It's been a close call each time, but I have remembered. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Brett Mills, who you will all have seen today as well. So Brett is a visiting professor of media studies at Edge Hill University, and he's an honorary professor of media and culture at the University of East Anglia. He's the author of Animals on Television, The Cultural Making of the Non-Human, and is part of the team undertaking 2 AHRC funded projects, Multispecies Storytelling, More Than Human Narratives About Landscape, and Multispecies Multisensory Storytelling to engage disadvantaged groups in changing landscapes. And the paper that he's presenting today is entitled, Who is Sallie Gardner? Towards a Multispecies Media Studies. Take it away whenever you're ready, Brett.
Thank you, Lara. Okay, so who is Sallie Gardner towards a multi-species media studies? A key theme of this conference is for us to think about where critical animal studies is now. And I've taken that as a catalyst for thinking about my own field, which is, broadly speaking, media studies. Here's what seemed odd to me. There is a natural alliance between media studies and critical animal studies because there are congruences between their interests and their goals. As Nick Couldry notes in the book Keywords for Media Studies, critical media studies has largely been interested in media's power over society, politics, the economy, and so on. This interest in power would, you would hope, serve as a way for media studies to ally itself with animal studies, which of course itself often focuses on power, just as media studies has aligned itself with, say, feminism, trade union movements, and critical race theory. Indeed, one of the ways in which I've often tried to sell animal studies to my media studies colleagues is via comparison with existing alignments. But where they seem to see debates about gender, race, disability, and class as naturally aligning with media studies, for some reason, species-based matters are assumed to be a step too far. Another route I've tried to take in indicating the value animal studies may have for media studies is in indicating how animals have been a part of popular media since its inception. There are obvious examples here, such as the long-standing film and television star Lassie, prestigious wildlife documentaries such as Planet Earth 2, the centrality of animals to children's television and film exemplified here by Peppa Pig, and animals in dramas such as the international co-production Commissar Rex. It's harder to avoid animals in popular media than it is to encounter them, and that media studies routinely fails to spot them points to a quite astonishing act of anthropocentric blindness. But more than this, the very existence of the media that is examined in media studies is dependent upon animals and animal-human relations. After all, cinema is a solution to a problem that had plagued human cultures for centuries, and it was this: how do animals run? Many animals move their legs too fast for the human eye to follow, and there'd been disagreement for some time over whether horses, when they gallop, ever have all their feet off the ground at the same time. This painting from 1821 is representative of a lot of depictions from this time, which show no one really knew how horses moved, with this oddness of all four legs pointing in different directions at the same time. Responding to this problem, enter Edward Maybridge, a British photographer who in 1872 was hired by the then governor of California and horse owner Leland Stanford to try and solve this question of horse movement. What Maybridge did was set up a system capable of slicing a horse's movement into a sequence. What you have here are 24 cameras, you can see them numbered in the shed at the back, lined up in a row, set to take a photograph. It's each set to take a photograph when the cords on the floor at the front are triggered. Maybridge then got a horse to run across those cords, triggering a sequence of photos that captured the stages of the animal's movement. It's this sequence that is serving as the very faded backdrop to this presentation, and it's called Horse in Motion. And Maybridge was the first to prove that horses do indeed, as they run, have moments when they are not touching the ground at all. The second and third images on the top row here show this. From this, it was realized that if you created a machine that showed these images in quick succession, you could give the impression of movement. In effect, the very principle that still underpins all forms of contemporary audiovisual media. But here's the important thing. While there were many machines developed at this time with different processes for showing these images and with different names, Maybridge called his a zoopraxiscope, literally a machine for understanding the movement of animals. Cinema was invented because of humans' desire to understand animals. It was initially a scientific tool, not, as we might understand it now, a form of entertainment. It is not an exaggeration to say, had horses run differently, cinema may never have been invented. So the very existence of media, and therefore the existence of media studies, is entirely dependent upon animals and human-animal relations. But as I say, this aspect of that history is often ignored. My field of media studies engages in a constant forgetting that its origins lie in human-animal relations. So now I want to reflect on why this might be. Of course, animals are marginalized throughout the humanities, but I want to suggest here specific and particular context that may make this more probable in my field of media studies. And I should note at this point, that this is speculative and just some suggestions as to why this might be. First, a couple of reasons that arose because of the key approaches that media studies takes towards its object of study. One of these is the focus on audiences. Since their inception, mass media have repeatedly been a matter of concern for governments and societies, with worries over their depictions of things like sex and violence. That these media are mass media, reaching large publics deemed to be passive dupes who absorb the material they're presented with and then recreate its worst elements in their everyday lives, has meant that there's always been worries about possible effects of media on the public. It's for this reason that mass media are usually more strongly regulated than other forms of culture. For example, most countries have systems where age defines what kinds of films you can see in the cinema, yet such systems don't exist typically or in the same way, say, for literature or art. Now, most of my colleagues wish we could just move on from this topic because countless studies have shown that there's not really any such thing as media effects. But it does mean that the audience has been a key object of media studies in a way that it hasn't, say, for literature studies. And of course, when we're talking about audiences, we're talking about humans, even though we all know anecdotally of dogs and cats that watch television. The need to keep coming back to discuss mass media in terms of its audience shapes interest in it in human-only terms. And this may be one reason why media studies persists in its anthropocentrism. Secondly, and a logical extension of this interest in audiences is the idea of public service broadcasting. Now, not every country in the world has public service broadcasting, but it is a dominant idea in terms of television and radio, especially in Europe. While it is shaped in different ways in different nations, the fundamental notion of public service broadcasting is that media can fulfill a role within democracy, aiding citizens in their engagement with the society they live in via access to information. But to have an idea of public service broadcasting, you have to have an idea of the public. And while who constitutes that public is a key debate within media studies and media policy, one thing is always unarguable, that that public is understood as human. It might perhaps be interesting to explore how the public of public service broadcasting might be conceived in a more than human way. But what the idea of public service broadcasting does inadvertently is shape mass media around human concerns, and it seeks to serve this public which is unthinkingly human only. Thirdly, and following on from ideas of public service broadcasting, is that media studies has often been interested in institutions and technology. Mass media such as television and radio are often produced by large institutions, with the public of public service broadcasting usually being structured nationally. Examining how these institutions function and how they're affected by things like government policy and funding is important in order to understand the kind of things that are made. This is not to say that, say, literature studies doesn't examine the publishing industry, But it is to say that media studies focus on those institutions to a much greater degree. Similarly, media studies is interested in the technology of the culture it examines much more than other humanities subjects often are. Indeed, television itself often foregrounds its own interest in technology, with wildlife documentaries accompanied by making-of programs which outline the new cameras, the new recording equipment that made the program possible. But this focus on institutions and technology inevitably again points towards the prioritization of the human. Institutions are human-centered organizations, and technologies are presented as evidence of humans' ingenuity. Again, then these foci invite modes of inquiry that normalize the human as the only topic of interest. Next, and related to the matter of technology, is that mass media's technology typically adopts an observational mode. What do I mean by this? If we think of the camera that is used in media making, it's a piece of technology that usually observes from a distance rather than enabling a genuine engagement with the lived experience of that which is observed. Literature, for example, can employ techniques intended to capture the experience of the characters whose stories it tells via voice of God narration that explains that experience, or things like stream of consciousness that aim to depict the messy matter of the internal monologue. While film and television can sort of do this, say via a voiceover or point of view shots, these rarely function to align the viewer with the experience being depicted in a manner comparable to that in literature. Indeed, the traditions and conventions that quickly developed when cinema and television were first invented were ones centered around observation rather than mimicry. Indeed, I've noted how this technology came out of scientific traditions intended to objectively make sense of the world, and despite some notable exceptions, it's this realist detached mode that remains dominant in mass media. Now, this causes a problem when thinking about how media might invite engagement with the more than human, for it does not have the tools and or conventions that encourage a destabilization of the human, a destabilization of the human observational point of view as the place from which meaning is made. The camera invites us to look at rather than align ourselves with, meaning the other is always an object to be studied. Next, and perhaps linked to concerns over how media technology objectifies that which it films, is a reticence to speak on behalf of. That is, media studies has throughout its history engaged with matters of inclusion and exclusion and the power that's embedded in having a voice and getting to speak. This is historically motivated work in which researchers ethnographically investigate groups they are not members of, reporting back to the academy what's been found. While well-intentioned, such approaches have more recently rightly been criticised due to the power relationships they draw on and reassert. Criticisms of white Western imperialist approaches to knowledge, that other individuals and communities, and constructs them as objects to be studied, means there's been a critique of the notion of speaking on behalf of or giving a voice to. Instead, the desired aim now is to include hitherto excluded communities within research as participants and researchers themselves. A related result is the exhortation for researchers to stay in their lane, that is, to acknowledge the social groupings of which they are a part and not to attempt to speak on behalf of others. This is a laudable act and does much to destabilize long-standing power relationships within research and encourage those like me, white, male, Western, to acknowledge the privileges those categories bring. Yet, an inadvertent consequence of this is what happens to groups and individuals, such as animals, that are not capable of speaking on behalf of themselves in a manner deemed legitimate and comprehensible. This is, of course, not to say that animals do not communicate, but it is to say that they do not communicate in ways that are deemed legitimate knowledge in the humanities. The laudable aim of not speaking on behalf of inadvertently renders animals mute and therefore absent. I'll note that it's interesting that when I do present on animal-related topics to media studies audiences for whom thinking about animals is not common, it is this problem that I often get questions about. People want to know, but how can we speak on behalf of animals when we know speaking on behalf of is wrong? Of course, animal studies as a whole grapples with this question, but I do wonder whether it's more acutely felt in media studies, which is extremely sensitive to this topic, And it seems that the field would rather preserve the edict of not speaking on behalf of, even if this results in the silencing of animals, than, heaven forbid, accept that in some cases, the possible positive outcomes of speaking on behalf of might legitimize what is usually rightly understood as a problematic practice. My final suggestion as to why media studies has not engaged with the field of critical animal studies as much as it might is extremely speculative, and it's this: that mass media lack a landscape tradition. That is, both literature and art have landscape traditions. They have movements and creators whose work actively and specifically engages with landscape as a thing to be interrogated and thought about, and who are now categorized in such traditions. When I studied English literature, I had to read Wordsworth and Coleridge as the lake poets, seeing their work as an active engagement with nature and the natural world. Similarly, depicting the landscape has a very long, obvious tradition in art, but this tradition doesn't really exist in mass media. To be sure, there are nature documentaries, but these are usually interested in animals, not landscape. And the important distinction here is that the landscape traditions of art and literature are often explicitly about stillness and reflection. They take a small, seemingly inconsequential moment or scene and insist on their legitimacy as a subject for depiction, precisely because their smallness is unpicked and pored over. When Wordsworth writes about daffodils, he's inviting the reader to pause, observe, to forget time and the self, and instead to be at one with the flowers he has seen. It's this stillness and reflection that motivates the existence of the landscape tradition. But mass media, such as film and television, are not very good with stillness. As media of movement, their interest is in change, speed, and kineticism. This is why nature documentaries are not usually about animals sleeping or doing little or aimlessly wandering about. They are instead about fights and death and birth and mating. They are about action. And this action doesn't invite the form of reflection that the landscape traditions in other cultural forms make possible. And I wonder, therefore, if this focus on action therefore invites a different audience relationship to nature and the natural world than that of art and literature, one which doesn't invite an acknowledgement of entanglement or congruity or kinship.
That's 5 minutes remaining. Sorry, Brett, 5 minutes.
That's fine, that's great. This, of course, begs the question of what a mass media landscape tradition might look like and whether indeed it is possible. As I say, these 6 areas are highly speculative and just starting points, but I'll return here to the title of my talk to indicate the ways in which animals are marginalized in media studies. This talk was called "Who is Sallie Gardner?" And it is that Sallie Gardner, and it is that Sallie Gardner is largely a largely unknown name that I see as symbolic of the ways in which the history of media studies has developed along anthropocentric lines. Some of you may already know or may have spotted who Sallie Gardner is from an image I used earlier, which was this: Edward Maybridge's Horse in Motion. But if you look down in the bottom left of this image, you'll see that the horse shown in this picture has a name. This horse is Sallie Gardner. That Maybridge chose to call this image The Horse in Motion rather than Sallie Gardner in Motion might be the first act of individual animal erasure in the history of cinema. So I'm going to change it. This picture, I've decided, is no longer called The Horse in Motion, but is now instead called Sallie Gardner in Motion. And this horse can perhaps make a claim to being fundamental to the invention of cinema. Had Sallie run differently that day, these images would have been different, which may have set Maybridge off on a completely different path. But here's the key thing. I work with lots of scholars who know this film history, this media history, indeed, who teach on and write about this history. Maybridge's photos and their importance to the history of media are fundamental to my subject area, such that pretty much every film course will teach about the topic in their first year. Yet while my colleagues know Maybridge, know these photos, and know the key animal is a horse, I have yet to meet anyone in my field who knew the horse had a name and who knew that that name is Sallie Gardner. She is repeatedly written out of this history, such that prestigious film studies scholars can be ignorant of her name. So perhaps this is where we start. right back at the beginning, right back at the origins of the moving image. We situate animals within media studies by acknowledging this is not just a horse, this is Sallie Gardner. And Sallie Gardner deserves for her name to be as well known as that of Maybridge or any other cinema pioneers. So if nothing else from this talk, please remember this. Remember the name Sallie Gardner. And remember too that she perhaps invented cinema. Thanks.
Thank you, Brett. Fascinating. And I teach it. I didn't know that. I'm one of those people. And I'm so grateful to Sallie. Oh, thank you for that. That's very illuminating, and is reconfiguring things in my mind. Thank you. So moving on then to our second speaker, Jessica Holmes. Jessica is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Washington. She's joining us from America, where it's very early in the morning, I know. She teaches an interdisciplinary writing program, and her research areas include environmental humanities, contemporary poetry, and critical animal studies. Her paper this morning for her is entitled Humanimal, Poetics, Femininity, Animality, and Pathology at the Species Border. So if you want to take it away whenever you're ready, Jessica.
Thank you, Laura. I don't know, I'm not able to turn my video back on because I think you turned it off.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No,
yeah, bear with me. I didn't realize I turned a few people off at the beginning. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that meant you couldn't turn it back on.
No, I didn't either until a minute ago. So no worries.
Still learning.
I've got slides anyway, so you guys are not going to be looking at my face anyway. All right. Thank you so much. Okay, let me go ahead and play. Okay, so yeah, as Laura said, my talk is called Humanimal, Poetics, Femininity, Animality, and Pathology at the Species Border. And it's kind of a short little window into a longer piece of mine that's anchored in reading and study of Banu Koppel's beautiful poetry text called Humanimal. And I wanted to kind of foreground it here at this conference because I think it's a text that not only kind of wrestles with the interconnections between anthropocentrism and speciesism and other forms of exploitation and oppression of the body, both the human body and non-human bodies, but it also kind of demonstrates how poetry specifically can be a really generative space in which to explore and contest some of these boundaries and the systems that they either uphold or are often used to kind of justify and uphold. So this is the text, Humanimal by Banu Koppel, which for those that aren't familiar, it's a 2009 book based on or kind of around the semi-mythological and semi-historical story of the Bengali wolf children. Their names are Amala and Kamala, and they're sometimes referred to as the Bengali wolf children, sometimes referred to as the wolf girls, also the feral children. So they essentially kind of embody this idea of a quote unquote humanimal, i.e. a creature which is supposedly half human and half non-human animal. And that's the literal definition, but I also understand humanimal to be a word we can use to describe different types of hybrid bodies. So especially bodies that are deemed lesser or subhuman on account of their presumed otherness. And somewhat ironically, I suppose the term can also be said to describe every human body, right? Since humans are biologically an animal species. So in that way, it kind of highlights the falsity of that binary by exposing the sort of degrees of overlap and relation in a wide variety of creatures. And Koppel's text is basically a long form prose poem. So it's kind of interesting from a genre standpoint as well, in the sense that the genre kind of reflects this idea of hybridity and border crossing, being multiple things at once. And I'm not going to have time here to go like super deep into a lot of close reading for this talk, but I encourage everyone to check out the book yourself if you're interested. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So there's a lot of different legends and myths of children raised by wolves, which I'm sure some of you are familiar, you know, things like Romulus and Remus, Kipling's Mowgli, the Lobo Wolf Girl of Devil's River, just to name a few. A lot of these kind of recur in different forms throughout like Indo-European cultures and time periods. And associations between children and wolves have also been applied in non-fictional contexts. So, for example, homeless orphans who were abandoned during the war and evacuation of East Prussia in the 1940s were labeled Wolfskinder, aka wolf children. The term feral children has been used to describe child victims of abuse and abandonment, as well as to explain the purportedly animal-like characteristics and behavior of children with congenital defects or disabilities of different sorts. And Amla and Kamla are often referred to as feral children throughout the kind of historical literature. And the poem or poems of Humanimal is in conversation with a few different source texts, as well as the author Koppel's own experiences traveling to Midnapur, India. She's a British Indian writer. I don't think I mentioned that. So Midnapur is the site of the girls' capture and care. And so she includes original photographs of the girls. And then she also includes references and direct quotes from the diary of Joseph Singh, who was the sort of captor of these two girls. And he published a book called Wolf Children and Feral Man in 1942, which was about a decade after the second wolf girl's death. And the diary provides almost a day-by-day personal account of Singh's observations and experiences. But it's a little bit complicated because the authenticity of that text and Singh's story at large has been pretty widely disputed and debated, especially in recent decades. There's a book called L'anime des enfants lus, forgive my French, by a French researcher called Serge Aroul. And he talks about the ways in which the diary and the girls themselves basically functioned as a commercial asset for Singh, he was running an orphanage and he was struggling to sustain that orphanage financially at the time. And so he kind of wrestles with this possibility that the diary may have been written after the fact, not actually in real time, and maybe not even during the girls' lives at all, as he claimed that it was. And so Amala, the first wolf girl, she died around age 2, which was after only a little under a year under Singh's care. And then Kamala, the older wolf girl, she died 9 years after her capture, which would have been around age 17. Testimonies published in the 1950s describe Singh beating Kamala, possibly in order to make her perform "quote unquote" wolfish acts in front of visitors. And so Aroul theorizes that both of the girls may have had neurological disabilities. He thinks Kamala may have had a hard time walking and communicating due to something called Rett syndrome. And this kind of lines up with the historical context, because in poverty-stricken colonial era India, children with severe disabilities were often abandoned. And so it is possible that the girls really were orphans. And as recounted in Humanimal, Koppel encounters the enduring pathologization of poverty among children during her visit to Midnapur. So this is in contemporary times. In a church garden, village children offer to show her the graves, and she takes their, quote, sticky paws in her own. Quickly interrupted by the prelate, Koppel is told to stay away from the children because they are, quote, very dirty and could give her an infection. Get away, children, he cries, I'll skin you alive. Here we witness not only the pathologization of those in poverty, but also their association with animalistic qualities, as the prelate refers to the children's paws and threatens to skin them as one might butcher an animal. Koppel's research and writing project is motivated not only by an interest in the story of Amala and Kamala, but also by the story of her own father's upbringing. So there's kind of like elements of memoir threaded through this text. Her father was raised by a widow mother in extreme poverty in India during the late 1930s and 40s. Couple's father was one of 16 children, only 7 of who survived into childhood. And among the myriad violences he suffered in Humanimal, Couple maps the scars on her father's leg from a street beating. So we kind of encountered this notion of the body as a testimony, a scar serving as a literal embodiment of experience, in this case, violence, permanently written onto or into the body. Superimposing a photographic image upon a map of a London neighborhood, Couple's father eventually moves to England and becomes the first Asian headmaster in the UK. And so Couple's kind of navigating through this image in the text, multiple different scales of violence, kind of conjuring for her reader a manifestation of British colonial violence and forced poverty marking the individual body through this image of her father's limb. This body, which I argue is the Humanimal body, resides at the center of my poetic reading. In the case of the wolf girls' bodies who grow sick from the human food they fail to digest, Couple asks, quote, "Is everything inside the body a kind of liquid, a way of taking information from site to site?" Indeed, throughout the book, the Humanimal body acts as a site, or rather a constellation of many different sites of movement, attachment, estrangement, memory, and resistance. Remembering her father's seemingly premature death in his 50s in a British hospital, Couple recalls the doctor telling her privately, quote, "His body was clearly ravaged by the debilitating effects of poverty, early malnutrition, and the multiple musculoskeletal traumas that he appeared to have sustained as a child. It's a miracle he lived this long. He should really have died as a child," end quote. So herein we encounter the pathologized body, again, pathologized as a direct result of violence and oppression, and a simultaneous resilience by way of that very body. So I'm interested in looking not only at kind of discourses of the body like pathologization, but also paying attention to the peripheries of how we kind of define that body and the border markings. And it's the peripheries that Humanimal as a text really kind of purposefully inhabits. So peripheries of bodies, perspectives, stories, genres, times, places, spaces, and species, of course. The book is, as I mentioned, fittingly written in a hybrid form, as Couple blends contemporary free verse with undercurrents of mythological folklore, historical documentary, and personal memoir to create a flowing yet fragmented long-form prose poem. The poem moves intermittently from site to site, from fractured notes on her experiences at Bednapur to memories of her father and past, to old photographs and scenes from Joseph Singh's journal, to the imagined thoughts of Amla and Kamala themselves. So the title Humanimal kind of reminds and reconnects readers to our own positionality. Humans, as I mentioned, of course, being animals themselves. We often use animal and the language of animality as a pejorative, but evolutionary and cognitive science establishes the biological fact that Homo sapiens, a member of the hominid family, are undeniably an animal species. Though used by Couple to describe specific bodies situated at the border of separate species categories, Humanimal accurately describes every human body. The well-documented opposition between the terms human and animal has been employed to segregate, enslave, exploit, and murder human and non-human beings throughout history. Generally speaking, the more animal a human body, that is, the closer to the border between human and non-human species a body is regarded by those with power, the less rights that human is likely to be granted, and the more oppression that human is likely to undergo. Examples abound, from indigenous peoples looked upon as brutes and savages, to Black slaves who were legally considered 3/5 of a person, to World War II prisoners of war subjected to vivisection. Animalistic language continues to be frequently used by those in power in order to debase and devalue individuals and groups of their choosing. In a 2019 essay, Carol Adams tracks the sexual politics of meat in the Trump era, which includes examples of Trump and other powerful men using animalistic and usually misogynistic language to objectify women, words like bitch, piggy, pussy, dog, cow, etc. The collapsing of the supposed human-animal distinction frequently serves as either an underlying premise for violence toward some humans or a violence in and of itself. We can draw a parallel between the killability of animal lives and that of human life, such as the collateral damage in war. John Sambamatsu contends that the two are not only linked, but that speciesism is the source of social injustice. A politics which does not place our enslavement of other beings at its center, conceptually and politically, cannot possibly succeed. Speciesism is not merely one more ism, but in fact lies at the root of every form of social domination, he writes. National and international statistics on violent crime strongly support the link between violence and animals, violence toward animals and violence toward humans. According to the National District Attorneys Association guidebook, violence toward animals is a predictor that an abuser may become violent toward people. 43% of school shooters have animal abuse in their background. Animal control and humane investigators are often the first responders to violent homes. Animal abuse is more prevalent in homes that experience child abuse and domestic violence, and the co-occurrence of multiple forms of violence increases future violence. So dominant cultural attitudes and practices that illustrate species' prejudices against non-human animals include hierarchies of killability. They do not only apply across human-animal lines, but also across animal-animal lines. Some animals are more killable than others. The most obvious example is that most American pet owners, and of course, that's a term that indicates a great deal of objectification and dominance, deeply value and care for their dogs and cats, yet think nothing of eating the killed body of a cow or a pig. The distinction between wild animals and domesticated animals presents additional evidence of the dominant hierarchical positioning that humans apply to different animal species. In the example of the wolf girls, their quote unquote owner, Singh, attempts to domesticate the so-called wild animal in order to make human, or rather to extricate the human by obliterating that which is regarded as animal. So after their capture, the girls literally have their bones broken and reset, their arms and legs are shaved, they're basically beaten and mutilated under the pretense of rehabilitation and care. In our contemporary industrial context, domesticated animals, with some notable examples like dogs and cats, are some of the most oppressed and least protected beings, while at least among wilderness and conservation circles, wild animals are often deemed worthy of certain protection, status, and/or respect. The Endangered Species Act, the protection of public lands, and specified hunting seasons and regulations are notable examples. And of course, there's exceptions to the exceptions as well. But in some sense, I would argue that wild animals are considered of pure nature, or capital N nature, whereas animals bred for human exploitation, whether as pets or through industrial farming, are not natural ecological subjects. Rather, they are supposedly of the human sphere, bred for the sole purpose of suiting our modern consumptive needs and desires, and therefore deemed unworthy of the natural freedoms of, say, a polar bear or a bush elephant. Again, there are exceptions to that. This particular brand of species thinking is an argument based not on intelligence or sentience even, but on eco-purity. And of course, such thinking also tends to operate upon a false nature-culture divide, thoroughly debunked by post-structuralist scholars and eco-critics alike. Species' hierarchies are a means of passing authoritative moral judgments about the non-value of any given body. The story of the wolf girls provides an example of such moral judgments, but it also complicates and erodes binaries like human and non-human, wild and domestic, nature and culture. The wolf girls' value as passive objects stems from their supposed novelty as uniquely hybrid creatures. But illogically, their persecution as threatening subjects also stems from their hybrid status. In the case of Amla and Kamala, domestication of the supposed wild animal, interestingly, both increases and decreases that body's presumed value. Normative.
Sorry,
okay,
5 minutes left, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Okay, normative human lives are inherently considered more valuable within the social hierarchy. And so in Singh's view, animal qualities have to be excised out of the girls as a malignant tumor might be excised from a body. But ironically, as the girls become more human, they also become less economically valuable to Singh. Visitors travel to the orphanage to see the girls perform their humanimality, walking on all fours, consuming raw meat, and howling at the moon. The exploitative gaze of these allegedly paying spectators, reminiscent of modern day zoogoers, reflects the simultaneous fascination with and disgust at these other beings. Amla and Kamala's behavior, whether genuinely deemed wolfish or perhaps more accurately, according to a roles analysis attributed to symptoms of disability, is likewise regarded with disgust by their human caretakers. Koppel quotes from Singh's journal entries in Humanimal: a feral wolf child is, quote, freakish, a hideous looking being, this other disastrous thing. Singh's original descriptions of the mother wolf from which the girls are snatched, interestingly, bear no remarks of such disgust. In Wolf, Children, and Feral Man, he writes, quote, her nature was so ferocious and affection so sublime, it struck me with wonder. I was simply amazed to think that an animal had such a noble feeling, surpassing even that of mankind, the highest form of creation, end quote. A sense of purity pervades Singh's characterization of the mother wolf, though it also has to be acknowledged that this purity doesn't prevent Singh's violence toward the wolf. Just moments after Singh is struck with wonder at the mother wolf, his men pierce her through with arrows, killing her. Nevertheless, this perceived purity sets up a strange duality with regard to the humanimal spectrum. To appear and behave entirely animal is noble and natural, and to behave entirely human, a standard to which even Singh himself ironically fails to live up to repeatedly, as he displays lots of animalistic qualities himself, is normal, civilized, and natural. But to inhabit a liminal borderland between the categories of neurotypical human and non-human animal is to elicit cultural disgust and ultimately to warrant rehabilitation or fixing. Sarah Deckett-Ray discusses the phenomenological pattern of human disgust towards certain bodies and the ecological other from 2013, exploring the intersections of disability, the body, and the environment. Ray argues that the environmental movement deploys cultural disgust against various communities it sees as threats to nature. Disgust shapes mainstream environmental discourses and vice versa, and it does so by describing which kinds of bodies and bodily relations to the environment are ecologically good, as well as which kinds of bodies are ecologically other. This discourse of disgust enforces social hierarchies, even as it seeks to dismantle other forms of hegemony, end quote. So because of their hybrid status, the wolf girls become what Ray calls ecological others, impure, dirty, unnatural subjects distinguished from good ecological subjects like the mother wolf. In addition to being impure, their atypical bodies and behavior are perceived as downright threatening to Singh and company in their non-conformity. Critical disability theory scholar Hannah Monroe discusses medicalized constructions as normative behavior and non-conformity in post-structural analysis of conformity and oppression. I'm going to actually skip through that quote just in the interest of time, but basically she talks about the ways in which impurities get kind of pathologized and then medicalized, which is right in line with both like her assessment of 20th century medical discourse and this particular example of Amla and Kamala. So basically their disabilities become objects of social control. And in that way, in the case of the wolf girls, Singh kind of attempts to neutralize any threat that they pose to social cultural paradigms and the value judgments that those paradigms impose. So I'm going to kind of end there just in the interest of time, but I also will just quickly mention that I've kind of focused in this presentation mostly on animality, since this is a critical animal studies conference, but the wolf girls are also very much pathologized on account of their femininity and their status as girls. So from an eco-feminist perspective, especially thinking about, the notion of an ethic of care, they highlight different forms of resistance and nurturing that really trouble the ruling hegemonic structures that we live within. And like their animality, their femininity is very threatening to normative anthropocentric conceptions of human dominance. And the text, Koppel's text, offers multiple alternative paradigms or examples of restorative care that is maternal care. So the mother wolf, also the local river in Midnapur, which constitutes a kind of mother figure, as well as this model of sisterhood between the girls. And all of these examples contrast markedly with the predatory masculinity or patriarchy of the father, i.e. Reverencing. He is a reverend, but he's also, a father in the sense of being an adoptive father figure. And then there's also the colonialist history and context, of course, but that's for another talk. So I'll just end by kind of saying that the poetic figures of the Wolf Girls model a radical disruption of the human-animal binary, yield generative insight into the interlocked histories of violence, and shake seemingly unshakable paradigms of colonialism, patriarchy, and speciesism. The end. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Jessica. That was really fascinating and horrible. At times I feel so sad, but equally fascinating. So often the way with critical animal studies, isn't it? And I'm sure that will facilitate some really interesting discussion later. So then I will move on to our third and final speaker in this panel, and that's Kristina. Kristina, I'm aware that I also think I asked you, hold on, have I stopped you from being allowed to?
Yes.
There we go. There we go. I've
Oh.
asked you to, there we go. So
Great.
Kristina is a student on the Critical Animal Studies course at Lund University in Sweden. And Kristina is also a documentary filmmaker and producer. And today her paper is entitled "To Represent a Cow." So take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's been such an interesting day. I don't have so much experience in the academia, so I've had a little bit of, it's been a challenge for me to follow all the presentations, but it's been really interesting as well. So now, do you see a full screen or do you see my notes?
Full screen.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay. As you said, I work as a documentary filmmaker. And I worked with film for more than 20 years. And for some time now, I've been interested in questions about the way humans treat animals and how I can use film as a way to put a spotlight on that relationship. And during this 20 years of filmmaking, I never had so much trouble finding money to make these films. I don't seem to get across to the financiers the brilliance of this theme, and that made me really a bit confused, a bit frustrated, and it made me find this course, Critical Animal Studies in Lund, which I attended this spring. And there I found a lot of books and texts and persons reflecting on these subjects, and I got really hopeful and inspired, and this was kind of a whole new world to me that opened up. And I decided to bring my film project, or one of my film projects, into the course. And then I wrote about it in the paper. And so this presentation will be about giving you an insight to some thoughts that I have in the beginning of this film project. And as this is kind of new for me, and the project is new, I'm looking forward very much to get some feedback and comments and questions from you afterwards to make this idea grow. So how do I? So I started to film a group of cows. They live at a farm where they can walk about as they want. The farm is quite small and the cows are bred for producing meat. My aim with this project is to explore if I, when filming, is able to find a sense of being together. I want to create a curiosity for the animal with its own agency. The aim is to create something else than looking at them, as I believe is the case in most nature and wildlife films. I'm not so interested in facts about the cows as I am of making a connection with them. The idea is that making a connection is also making a change. When writing, I've written directly to one of the cows I filmed, and I found this form of communicating I find it that it makes me aware of my own prejudices, and it also helps me not to forget the purpose of the project, that is to create a connection. This I will also try in this presentation, so we will see how that works. In this presentation you will meet different cows from the farm, but in the film I hope there will be only one. And this is, I wanted to show you a clip from the first day of filming, and if the video doesn't work, please tell me, then I will skip it.
It works.
Great. Dear cow, let us present ourselves and the setting for our meeting. We stand opposite of one another on a meadow surrounded by a fence in a small village outside Gothenburg in Sweden. If we stretch our necks, behind you we can see the ocean. At least I can, because I'm standing upright on my 2 legs. You stand on your 4 legs. My 2 extra legs, which I hold the camera with and reach to pat you on the nose with, those are called arms. You are a Hereford cow with your breeding origin in Great Britain, but born here on the farm. I am of Caucasian race, although the relevance of dividing humans into different races is discussed. I could also describe myself as a white Northern European middle-aged woman. I'm quite tall to be a woman, my eyes are bluish and my hair is grayish, if I don't dye it, which I do. Your eyes, they are brown. You have curly fur in large brown and white patterns. The fur is long to be the fur of a cow, I think. When I touch it, the hairs feel rougher than what they appear. You have a tag in your ear, a soft, damp mule, a tail, and if I may say so, quite a big head. By filming and writing, besides creating a connection between us, I want to explore how can an understanding for another animal arise through film? What do I need to learn and unlearn to achieve this as a filmmaker? In other films I've done, I also try to achieve a sense of recognition. For example, I filmed humans working in places very different from mine. I searched for connection and a sense of belonging. I filmed for long periods until I became a part of the everyday life for those I filmed. We worked side by side, me with a camera. And as time went by, we found a number of things we shared and had in common. This made it easier for me to represent them and also for the audience to recognize themselves, understand what the other person's body felt and engage in their thoughts. Even if the cases with the person in front of the camera and the person watching lived completely different lives and had totally different experiences. So, dear cow, do you believe that this sense of connection is possible to create also between us, a human and a cow? Me? I'm not sure, but I do know that I need to find a different starting point for us. Because everything I learned in my life, I learned by being a human in a society where we humans put ourselves above all other species. And that is not a good starting point for a meeting and to then represent you in a film. To start off, I found some things I need to unlearn. To be able to represent you, I need to unlearn that you are less valuable than me and that your life is less valuable than mine. And learn that my language, my way of communicating is more sophisticated than yours. And learn that my time is more valuable than yours. And learn that my desire to film you is more important than your needs, perhaps being alone. And learn that you are representative of all cows instead of only of yourself. In other words, it matters if I film you or any of the other cows. I'm looking at you, and you are looking at me, and we share a moment together. I feel both nervous and curious. It feels like you are a bit interested in me, but not being able to talk to you makes me worried, and after a while disappointed that you look back at me without interest. And I'm afraid that my idea that we would be able to interact in a meaningful way will be perceived as naive and not taken seriously. And how could our meeting even have a chance if I at the same time as we meet question that we are equals? I do hope that we soon find things we have in common, that we can enjoy the weather together. Maybe we will get afraid of the same sounds. Maybe we both appreciate when our hair is being stroked. You and your friends are the kind of cows that are not noticed that much by us humans, probably because you are bred for slaughter and production and not to be with us. But I think it's more important than ever that you are noticed, talked about, have films made about you, portrayed in the way your life is turning out. And also I think this fact that you are bred for meat for human food makes it extra difficult for us humans to actually see you as the unique cow you are, in our minds and in our imaginations. In John Berger's famous essay, Why Look at Animals?, he describes how humans have lost ability to see you. He writes about the tragic cost of humanity's march towards progress and away from the natural world. He claims that this has made us alienated and we lost contact with you and also with ourselves. I'm wondering, have also you alienated yourself from us? In response to the question, why look at animals, the author Annette Pick asks if we even have the right to look at animals. What kind of gaze are carried out when we just presume that animals are available to us to look at? The podcast where I heard her made me see another shortcoming in building a healthy relationship with you. The question I should have asked before I started filming was, may I film you? Unfortunately, this would have been an illusionary question because I wouldn't have understood the answer. Now I had the camera between us when we first met. But maybe that was why you left me that day. You stayed for a bit, and then you walked away to the other side of the meadow, even though the grass wasn't at all greener there. It feels embarrassing that my ignorance and my ideas, that my opinion doesn't count, that your opinion doesn't count as much as mine in our common project. With that said, I did feel like an intruder when I walked into your group, which means that at least my body can feel when I'm doing something questionable. The risk of doing wrong. When with you in this meadow, people will enjoy watching you eat grass in this idyllic place with a sea view. It's a nice and comforting picture. My fear with doing this film is that it makes us humans comfortable in the way we treat you, and that we get the feeling that it's not that bad after all. So I see a risk with this project. Even if I do succeed in portraying you as an individual, you may still be perceived as a representative of other cows and their lives. And the effect of our project will be the opposite of my intention. All perspectives might be held onto where we lived close together and where animals weren't a part of an industry. So the challenge is to make a film where you only represent yourself, not all cows, since the way you live your life says very little about the life of most other cows. At the same time, the film do need to create bridges from your life to the life of other cows, where the majority stands inside cramped stalls without ever putting their mule into dewy grass.
5 minutes left, Kristina.
I don't want to make a film that reproduces prevailing conditions. I need to make a film that both focuses on you as an individual and on the system that enables the oppression to which animals are subjected. That is my challenge. And I'm in the starting point on the project of finding out how this is done. But I do believe I believe it's important to take the time to spend time at the place, try to listen, try to be patient and create trust. And then if I succeed with this and the film is ready, my goal for the screening, for meeting an audience, is to make a large video projection in an art gallery where your gaze meets the audience gaze, where you are the center of attention, where people have come to meet you. In such a context, I believe the gaze you'll meet will be a different type of gaze than the one you meet being on the farm. I believe that this kind of context might, at least for a moment, change the relationship between you and the humans. Another kind of conversation can take place. Now, when doing this presentation, time has passed. I'm looking at you at the screen, looking back at me, and I realize that I'm not sure that you are still around. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina. That was beautiful, and I found it profoundly moving. So thank you so much. What a wonderful way to kind of come full circle in that respect from Brett's original topic or dissection of the mass media. Thank you so much to all three presenters, and we're now going to open up to questions and discussion. So if I could ask you, if you don't mind turning on your video, please do, so that we feel a bit more like we're together in a space. And we haven't lots of nice words in the chat, but no questions, I don't think. So does anyone have a virtual hand? A question via a virtual hand? I know I had lots of thoughts. Most of my thoughts are not particularly questions, but more, I just found all three of those so inspirational in very, very different ways. I was thinking about the fact that if I go back to the beginning of it, that I also always assumed and never really thought about it, that Sallie was a male horse. I just totally assumed it was a male horse because, of course, you know, patriarchy. So yeah, that was just my thought about that. Does anyone have any questions before I just go through my musings?
Can I ask a question of Kristina?
Please.
Okay. I was just really interested in thinking about the parallels and kind of conversation created between Brett's presentation on media, right? And then your beautiful piece, Kristina. And I was particularly interested in the notion of like address, of this, like writing a letter to a cow. Maybe like, because I'm a poet, that's a particularly interesting, just kind of like genre activity to me. And I was thinking about what Brett said, I think early in his presentation about, you know, forms of communication that are or aren't deemed, you know, legitimate or legible. And that's really interesting because you framed your project as wanting to make a connection, right? And then a letter is obviously not comprehensible to a cow, right? And in that sense. And I know, of course, you're not expecting the cow to literally hear the letter, but I was wondering if you could maybe say anything about, you know, that process or even the motivation between this act of address in the context of a project about trying to make this connection through these different you know, the fusion of these different forms of media and writing.
Yes, thank you. For me, it was a way also to have fun writing this paper in this critical animal course. And I've got so much energy by thinking that the cow, that I had this conversation with the cow, and it made me think of so many things that I hadn't thought about without having the cow in my mind. It got me very aware of things I I never thought of even asking whether I could film, and I don't know how I could do that, but it never even crossed my mind. I've kind of seen the cows there, and I'm coming there with my camera, and I didn't question my right to come there and film them. And when I started to do that, so many questions arise from that. And then it's a later problem to how to translate that into a film without me being in the film. I think that will be an interesting process, and I think I don't want to totally. I think I need to be in the film somehow, because I don't want to make. I don't think. I think it's needed to kind of have some kind of reflexive method. Yeah, thank you.
And I also just think the notion of the connection is so beautiful and is such a huge part of, because it made me think about things that I wouldn't have thought about if it hadn't been particularly that connection that I think obviously requires your presence, at least to some extent, but then you start grappling with the same questions, you know, of anthropocentrism or you know, just putting yourself in the picture. Go on, sorry, do you have a... No, we have a raised hand from Seth. So if you want to go ahead, Seth.
Sure, thank you. And let me unraise my hand before I forget that. Lots of really good stuff. All of those talks were really thought-provoking. So I have a couple comments maybe I'll just share that a little bit apply to each one, and then if anyone wants to respond to it. First for Jessica, the Humanimals book is an interesting one for me too. I remember looking at that at some point in my dissertation research and then being like, oh, I can't deal with all the things that are in this book, so I'll just put that down and focus on other things. But if you haven't already, you might look at Sunara Taylor's work on disability in animals. Beasts of Burden is the name of that book, which I think is quite good. And it had me thinking about the idea of burden there too, because part of the intersection of disability and animals is this idea that we have a kind of, this image that we have as, thinking of ourselves as superior or whatever, that we have this obligation to intervene into the other worlds of other beings and to, overcome their apparent lack. Sunara Taylor says that part of our idea of disability is that people who are disabled lack something, just as we think that other animals, maybe lack speech or lack tool use or something. But in fact, of course, they're complete just exactly as they are, including disabled people. And so then we feel like we have to fill that lack. And so there's a kind of connection there in the Humanimals piece, because there's sort of this obligation to kill the wolf mother, assuming that's true, that the wolf was in relationship with these girls. Why do we feel like we need to rescue them from this state? Aren't they complete in what they are? Or to change the bodies of the girls, which is so horrific, traumatic, I'm sure. And that also links in my mind to this idea in the post-colonial theory too, that there's this white man's burden, right, of the colonizer who comes out and feels like, oh, we have to take over other lands, including India, to properly civilize it. That's part of the justification of colonialism. So just all those intersecting thoughts there. So I thought I'd just share that, and you can respond, or I guess I'll just say just quickly to the other. Well, maybe I'll let you respond, because if you have a thought, Jessica.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you for your comment. And yeah, I'll check out the work that you mentioned. I mean, yeah, there's no question there, so I'm not sure what to say besides, I think, yeah, I mean, it's like one of the really cool things about the book, but also one of the reasons it is really kind of difficult to write about is because it does draw together so many different aspects of, oppression and like the idea of othering. And yeah, there's, in terms of the sort of colonial framework, I mean, Joseph Singh obviously was not a white man, but yeah, he's very much like embodies this sort of predator, right, of transgressing this border between civilization and the jungle. And of course, there's a long history there in terms of British colonialization and the effects that it had just ecologically on those ecosystems. Like it altered them like forever. Like you can go there today and see the effects from an ecological standpoint. But yeah, he embodies so much of that sort of predatory captor. And the mother wolf is deemed, even as she's deemed like noble and pure, she's deemed like collateral damage, acceptable sacrifice to, as you said, like rescue these children or girls from a situation, which, I mean, of course, it depends on which myth or which historical account you're looking at, but from which perhaps they didn't need or want to be rescued. And she does, like toward the end of the poem, it's she kind of pans back and there's like this interlocking between all of these different girls, like throughout history and myth, and her Bonnet Koppel herself kind of envisions herself as like one of these little girls in this interlocking map. And it ends with this really restorative notion of the child actually returning to the jungle, and like the book as creating this hole in the divide, and the child returns to the jungle. And so it's really sad, but it's also like a kind of moment of maybe some sort of restoration or redemption.
Yes, thank you for that, for those thoughts. And then just quickly for Brett and Kristina, I saw a connection between both of yours in this idea of the specific animal, the specificity of the animal individual, whether it's the named horse versus the anonymous horse, or for you, Kristina, the desire to have it be a portrait of a particular cow, or a poem written to a particular cow, or sort of, letter, I guess, written to a cow. And for Kristina, I thought to myself, why make it a specific cow when it can also be a family? It's a community that you're representing. If that's helpful, or is it important that it's an individual cow, or can it be an individual community? After all, cows are community-oriented beings, in their herds and what have you. And so I don't know if Kristina or Brett, if you have thoughts about that idea of why it's important to have a specific named or at least identified animal as your subject matter.
For me, it has been important to think of a specific cow, yes, because if I don't think of her, it gets all blurry, because I lose her when I'm filming, and then I think it's important that it's one also to make a connection. Yeah.
I think I'd say the individual kind of matters, because once you start dealing with masses, it becomes much easier to treat a mass, a group of beings, badly than it is to treat an individual. And the species-based categories that humans impose upon the world around them is one of the ways in which that happens. It's much easier to kill 1 million cows than it is to kill one named cow that so the individual kind of matters. Though I was also interested in the notion of community you raised then, and that you extended that to like the cow's family. But I think I would understand, if I'm understanding these cows as kind of on a farm somewhere, actually the community is an interspecies one, that cow and its family are clearly not living just in a cow world. The kind of, the limits that are placed on what those cows can do are clearly coming from multiple spaces. And of course, other animals are living off those cows, off their dung and so on. And so there's this interesting thing about the ways in which we stay very often at the species level when we need to go in both directions, which is down to the individual and to the multi-species. But staying at the species level enables humans to treat other beings really badly. And once we go to the multi-species level that's about entanglements, that becomes much harder. And once we go to the individual level, that becomes much harder. So there's something, it's not surprising humans like talking about species.
Yeah, I think that's so right. And in Kristina's piece, just that tension between the cow representing all cows versus an individual. But as you say, Brett, it's like that sense, there's also the other direction that you can expand outward. That's that cross species, but in community, the sense of family or ecosystem that depend on one another. So thank you. That's insightful.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, starting with one from Julia, and this is for Kristina. Julia asks, have you gone to a spot in the pasture with your camera and seen if the cows come to you?
Yes. And then I also, then they come to me and they kind of say hello, and then they move away. So then I kind of walk after them, and then they kind of give them a little bit of attention, and then so that's how we kind of move around in this meadow. Yeah.
Can I just ask, so if they come to you, does that feel more to you like they're giving permission to that interaction that you're wanting to have with them?
I feel that they are curious, and I'm a little bit afraid of them. So I kind of, for me, it feels like we are building a connection. We're building trust. I kind of trust them not to hurt me, and then because they also had these babies for most of the time I was filming, I kind of felt that they were trusting me not to get aggressive and protecting their babies. And I don't know so much about cows. So that is also something I'm learning. Are they nice, peaceful animals, or can they bite? I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we had a question from Ted, and this is a question for Kristina, saying, I'll read it for you, saying, really enjoyed your video essay and reflections on intimacy and closeness. I was wondering if you had given any thought to the tradition of Colning, that's how I'm going to pronounce it, the beautiful and lyrical herd call that has such a long history in the Almont. I should have let you read this, Ted, shouldn't I? That has a long history in the peasantry, but as well to folklore and spirituality in relation to cows.
No, I haven't. Please tell me more.
Any willingness, Ted? Or maybe
otherwise I will check. I will
yeah. Oh well, actually Ted did follow up and say, as a way of creating a hierarchical connections.
Yeah.
So yes, interesting. And then a question from Jessica. This is for Kristina and possibly Brett. Jessica says, I wonder if it's actually possible to make a film or a poem or a picture where the animal only represents him herself. Isn't it representation and thus not the singular material animal being, by nature of being media art/art? Thoughts, Kristina or Brett?
Brett.
Okay. Yeah, there's the problem that a representation is always a representation. It's not the thing itself, but it's not. We kind of know that with human representations as well, or representations of anything, that it's a representation of. But of course, representations have social consequences. So I don't know, and it'd be interesting to see what kind of Kristina's view is on this. I don't know that my view would be that we're arguing for accuracy, because I don't know that that's possible, but I think I'd say the same for humans too. Instead, it becomes about an ethical approach, a kind of an aware approach, an approach that acknowledges the consequences of representation. The other thing that kind of hasn't been mentioned, which I think is a significant problem with kind of film and television stuff, is that obviously they're media centered around sight and sound. And for lots of beings, those aren't the primary senses. And so making sense of the world via something like film or via television, it is in itself a largely human act, because it takes the two senses that we sort of see as dominant and construct those as a key way to represent things. And so I don't know what the answer to that is, about whether you have to have films that include smells and touches as well. It becomes a complicated thing, but it's an awareness that there's always that translation, and that there's a power relationship in translating the experience of other beings for whom sight and sound are not their primary sense into film, which is going to prioritize sight and sound. So there's always going to be that problem. What we do with that, I mean, that's then the question, and obviously is what Kristina's really usefully exploring. But I don't know that I don't know that we're talking about getting to an accurate representation. I think, if I can ramble on a bit more, I think the key thing is multiple representations, and that's where I kind of have an issue, say, with the ways in which animals are often represented in wildlife documentaries. Is you get a penguin to represent all penguins, for example, and what matters, and I think what's useful about the work that Kristina and various other people are doing, is instead of kind of going, here's what a cow does, it's going, here's what this cow does, but then here's another film which is about this cow, and here's another film about a completely different cow. And in the same ways in which we have that idea of human representations, of kind of saying, you know, that you can't represent women, there's a multiplicity of that stuff. That logic applies to other species too.
Thank you. I've realized that the answer is 4DX, isn't it? Is anyone that's the key. I thought it was a gimmick to charge an extra £4.50 for a seat, but no, it's the key, guys. 4DX, at least over here, is you know, cinema that has like air and water and like things that touch you. I love it, but well, going back then, we've got quite a few now, but I'm going back to Lucas, who talks about the movie Gunda that just came out, and said that it seems to tackle very similar issues. It mainly follows the pig mum Gunda and her piglets without human narration, and it made Lucas think about what Kristina mentioned, the risk of such a project appearing as a justification for humane farming. Any thoughts or response?
I haven't seen it yet. It's on my list of things to see. I have a kind of link to watch it, and I'm slightly nervous about watching it. Part of it because it's in black and white, and it has this kind of arty aesthetic, which I think might connect to what was mentioned in the question there, that because from what I gather, it looks so pretty and it's so contemplative, that becomes a way of softening the depiction, which is actually about a farmed animal. So there's that kind of, I don't know, artiness, which I'm always kind of slightly suspicious of because of what that allows or can excuse, rather than a much more kind of rough and ready aesthetic, which might instead more accurately represent genuine kind of encounters and movement and liveliness. But it is a thing I need to kind of watch, I know.
Thank you. And then just to draw everyone's attention to the fact that we have a couple of YouTube links from Ted, who is in a library. Sorry, Ted, for trying to coerce you into talking, and you're in a library, but thank you for uploading a couple of links there with regards to Ted's earlier comment. And then we also have an article, a link to an article from Julia, thanks Julia, about viral footage about cows who broke out of their confines, which is particularly for the attention of Kristina. And then we do also have a question from Camille, which I think we can just squeeze in. A question for Kristina. Camille asks, could you talk a little bit about how you imagine engaging with multiple senses? I just set 4DX, touch, smell, taste, sound, etc., engaged in the encounter through your camera and making them palpable through the film to the viewer.
Well, I guess that will happen in the editing. I don't know how I will do that, and I don't know how to keep the connection that I think I made, and then I will continue to work on. And I don't know how to transform that to an audience, and that will be that is the work. Not to lose that and make the individual in front of the camera to connect with the persons watching the film, with me in between. And I have the tools are the film material, and I can edit, and I have sound. Yeah, I think I need to have a kind of experimental approach to the material. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Eva Marie, I'm so sorry because I know you've got your virtual hand up there. And I really apologize because I'm just aware that we don't really have any wiggle room because we have the roundup and reflection now back in the main room with another poem from Gordon. So I really apologize. Hopefully you might be able to draw that out of someone in a chat sometime tomorrow, and I'm so sorry for that. But I am aware I am aware that so now if we all leave this room, then we can go back to the main room where we'll just have a roundup for the day. But let me just, before you do that, just quickly say thank you so much to all three speakers, three such fascinating, inspirational papers. And thank you very much. Okay, so
can one save the chat somehow?
Yes, the chat is saved, will be saved. I will save it now. I will double check, but we are saving the chats in general, but I will save the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, and see you all in the main room.